Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Raza. Before we begin, I would like to provide you the fourth update to our crowdfunding campaign that we launched recently with the goal of raising 55,000 euros by January 10th so that we can continue with our independent and non-profit journalism in 2025. In last year's campaign, we managed to raise 53,000 euros thanks to 1,710 donors. And in this campaign, so far, we've managed to raise 30,700 euros thanks to 1,166 donors, which roughly makes around 56% of our crowdfunding target achieved. Unfortunately, the campaign has slowed down. As a comparison, last year, we had achieved 36,000 euros at this point in time, which is 5,000 euros more than we have currently achieved. And this despite the fact that we have 13,000 subscribers more than last year, as well as our videos have been watched 330,000 times in this month alone. There are only 13 days left, so if you're watching our videos regularly and have not donated so far, please just take a few moments and donate 3 to 5 euros or dollars. If all of our 155,000 subscribers, or just the amount of people watching this video, donate that amount today, we'll be able to reach our crowdfunding target with ease. If we do not reach this target, we will unfortunately have to scale back our capacities, especially in the German translation department, which is the most cost-intensive process of our organization. You will find the link to all of our donation platforms in the description of this video below. Today I'll be talking to Dr. Shir Hever, independent journalist, economist, and author. Shir is also the military embargo coordinator of the Boycott National Committee of the BDS movement. Dr. Shir Hever, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Zain.
Let's start with a report that you shared with me that will be published soon, titled, quote, "The military embargo is here," unquote, which shows how an arms export against Israel is spreading rapidly worldwide. Particularly in the global south, nations such as Colombia, Chile, Malaysia, Brazil, Turkey, Namibia, South Africa, and Turkey, and others have taken a number of measures in this direction. Even in Western countries, cracks are beginning to appear with regards to arms exports to Israel, and nations such as Netherlands, Australia, Canada, Ireland, France, Portugal have moved in some way or the other in that direction. Could you elaborate on the most notable stories in regards to this military embargo taking place against Israel in the global south, and thereafter also highlight some movements that are taking place in the global north?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we are in a very dark time now. And the live stream genocide in Gaza, which is continuing, and people are being killed every day. There's still not enough food. There are still even children who are freezing to death. So it's very difficult in a time like this to celebrate or to say that we are winning. But I do think we need to highlight the fact that this genocide is not like other genocides in history, in many cases, in many aspects. And one of the aspects of this genocide is that the world is not staying silent, with the exception of mainly the United States and Germany, which are staying silent and supporting the genocide, arming the Israeli forces. Most countries in the world understand that there is a legal obligation to implement a military embargo. The military embargo is not a question of choice if they agree with it or not. It's simply enshrined in international law. And there are many attempts to hide, to lie, to obfuscate the international law. But there are so many reports by the world's leading legal scholars that say that buying weapons from Israel, selling weapons to Israel, and transiting weapons to Israel, these three things are illegal. And what we are starting to see that this is gradually being implemented. Gradually, of course, it's never fast enough because people are being killed as we are speaking. But we have to acknowledge that this is gaining momentum. And as you said, in the global south, but also in the global north. I think it's, of course, we can get into details and talk about many different countries. And in every country, there is a group which is working to promote the military embargo. But they're not just doing it on their own, they're doing it in a coordinated way. And it would not have been possible for countries from Namibia to Spain, from the Netherlands to Chile, to implement those policies and to stop the Israeli weapons if they are not sharing information, working together within the BDS movement as a global military embargo campaign, which is gaining momentum. How do we know that the military embargo is gaining momentum? Because the Israelis are acknowledging it. So from the very beginning of the genocide, the Israeli military said, we don't have enough ammunition, we need more ammunition. They've used more weapons on Gaza than makes any kind of sense, except in the sense of committing genocide and trying to completely destroy the Gaza Strip and kill the population. So they've used artillery which was designed against strong conventional armies in amounts that rival even the war in Ukraine on the tiny Gaza Strip. So this is a massive waste of ammunition, massive waste of explosives, and they're only able to do it because they keep importing from the United States. And to some, the second biggest is Germany. We have to say this because we are also in Germany as we are talking about this. So the dependency of the Israeli military on these imports is extremely high. But let's not make the mistake that only the United States and Germany can sustain the Israeli war machine. It doesn't work like this. Israel also depends on materials and equipment and components from other places. And that is where the military embargo is really disrupting the supply chain. So every time the Israeli arms companies are trying to make ammunition for the weapons that they get from the United States. For example, they need aluminum powder and they need explosives of different kinds, and they import them from private companies, sometimes in East Asia, bringing them on ships. The companies on East Asia are then targeted by military embargo campaigns. The dock workers refuse to load the materials. Newspapers are scandalizing that this is an illegal transfer of weapons. The ships then are accosted along the entire path because they're not able, once we have information that a ship is carrying weapons to Israel, then ports along the way refuse this ship the right to dock. And the insurance companies of these ships are being targeted by a military embargo campaign by various BDS groups saying you should not insure an illegal activity. The countries that give the flag to the ships, we've already had one case in which Portugal announced that they will not allow weapons to be delivered to Israel under a Portuguese flag. And because of that statement, Portugal has also gone and said, actually, we're also, by the same logic, we cannot allow weapons to be transited through the air. And if you just look at the map and you see how all the islands that Portugal has in the Atlantic Ocean, which have NATO bases through which cargo planes from the United States have to land on their way, then you see how effective this is. So what we're now seeing in Israel is the new budget that the government is submitting to the parliament, the Knesset, to vote upon. Now, according to Israeli law, the budget has to be approved by October before the next year or the government falls. We are now in December. The government has not been approved, but they're changing the laws. It's not really a state of law, Israel. It's becoming a sort of fascist militaristic dictatorship. But this government, in the new budget which they are submitting for approval, they are proposing tens of billions of dollars to be invested in Israeli supply lines to replace all of the components and materials that they are importing from the rest of the world. And this is completely impossible. One thing I can say about the Israeli military elite, the commanders of the army and so on, is that none of them actually remembers the wars of 67 and 73. These are very important wars that Israel fought in the last century. And of course, there are people in Israel who remember this, but none of them are serving in the military anymore because it's more than 50 years ago. And After the War of 67, which Israel considered to be a great victory and a massive military achievement, the biggest supplier of weapons to Israel at the time was France. And France said, unless you withdraw from the territory that you illegally occupied, we will impose a military embargo against you. And the response in Israel was, well, if there's a military embargo, let's build everything ourselves. We don't need France. We will make the artillery, the tanks, the airplanes, the ships, the guns. We'll make everything domestically in Israel. And they did spend a lot of money, and they diverted the Israeli industrial force in this direction. And it was a disaster. It was a disaster because in the war that came 6 years later, the War of 73, when Israel fought Syria and Egypt, which had Soviet weapons, the Israeli-made weapons were completely useless. Israel was about to be completely defeated, and the United States intervened and gave Israel American weapons in the middle of the war and changed the course of that war, prevented Israel from being completely defeated. This is a very interesting lesson from history that Israel completely forgot. They are repeating the same mistake that they made 54 years ago and think that they can build everything domestically. Let's not forget that Israel is not a very large country. It doesn't have the natural resources required to build this kind of supply chain or production chain to make all of the ammunition that they use. So this is just a declaration, a symbolic declaration of a government which knows that they have been ostracized in the whole world, and the military embargo is becoming very effective, and they're just trying to buy a little bit more time. Maybe they think that when Donald Trump becomes president in the United States, he will somehow save Israel, but that's the last card that they have to play.
As you've mentioned, the two largest suppliers of weapons to Israel continue to be United States and Germany. Has there been any effect on Germany when it comes to this arms embargo? And secondly, what legal consequences, if any, will powerful nations such as Germany face if they continue to export arms to Israel?
The only way I can answer this question is if I remind our viewers and listeners that we live in a world of global organizations and international law, which was established because of Germany. Let's not forget that during the Second World War, there was no United Nations, no International Court of Justice, no International Criminal Court. All of these international bodies were established because of the lesson of the Second World War and the German aggression, the fascist aggression of Germany. Now we live in this absurd situation in which, once again, the country which is violating these laws is Germany. And there is a difference between the way that the United States is violating and Germany is violating, because the United States considers itself to be a unipolar global empire, which is above the law, doesn't have to obey the rules, and they are losing a lot of their global power because of this arrogance. But Germany claims to be part of this global system, part of the EU, part of Germany has signed the Rome Convention of the International Criminal Court. So they are really in trouble. And that's why also Nicaragua filed a lawsuit and the International Court of Justice against Germany, because Germany can easily be proven to be violating its own principles and its own law. Unlike the United States, in Germany, Article 25 of the Constitution says that the international laws are above the German national laws, meaning that when German unions are transferring weapons to Israel, the transportation workers who are part of a union, if they agree to do this, they are breaking German law, actually, because of this Article 25. So yes, of course, the military embargo has impact, and it has an impact on many different levels. One, of course, is this lawsuit by Nicaragua, which has gotten a lot of Germans very concerned. There are public workers in Germany who signed a petition where they tell the government, we are in a legal problem now because you expect us to obey your orders in violation of international law. In addition to this, a lot of German companies, a lot of German or ships with the German flag, and German insurance companies and German subsidiaries of companies are participating in the transiting of weapons to Israel, which is illegal. And then they get into trouble with their partners, with the insurance companies or with the unions in whatever country they operate in. There are already worsening relations to the German industry with Spain, for example, where a lot of subsidiaries of German companies, including Rheinmetall, the gigantic German arms company, and these things threaten Germany's financial stability, its diplomatic relations, its reputation around the world. Over the last year, there have been many lawsuits against Germany and against the transiting of weapons. And the government has used the argument that actually they're not transiting weapons or they're not selling weapons to Israel. It's only so there's no need for the court to intervene. This argument has been sometimes substantiated with facts over certain things. Of course, there is a loophole that Germany invented for itself, which is to distinguish between weapons of war and other weapons that they don't consider to be weapons of war. Let me just give one example. The tanks for the Israeli Merkava, the engines for the Israeli Merkava tanks made by the German company MTU are used by the Israeli army to run over civilians in order to kill them. The idea that tank engines are not weapons of war is absurd. But Germany has used that argument in a court, and indeed weapon shipments have been delayed and disrupted by these court cases, so that in order to allow the German government to win the case, they stop the weapons. And in that kind of situation, in this situation, I say, well, we didn't lose the case. I mean, the court ruled against us, but if we stop the weapons, we won. That was the purpose. But I think that there is a political crisis in Germany. You're covering it a lot in your shows. The government, the coalition has fallen basically, and there's going to be an early election. And in this context, the German government is no longer able to effectively control its own lies and its own hypocrisy. And when they're now saying openly, yes, we are going to approve more export licenses to Israel for weapons, which everyone is seeing are used to commit a genocide. Amnesty International has written a very detailed report. Then it is a crisis for the entire German legal system and political system. Germany has put the interests of Israel, or maybe the interests of the U.S. empire, above its own survival in this context. So that is not going to stop the military embargo. So to answer your question, the military embargo is still gaining momentum and is still becoming more powerful. If anything, it shows to other countries that if they try to just scoff at international law and continue to sell weapons to Israel, the consequences can be devastating in terms of their international standing.
We've talked a lot about international institutions such as like the UN, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, shaping public opinion in terms of showing what's really happening in Gaza and thereby moving governments. However, you also mentioned the role of grassroots activism, trade unions, dock workers. Could you highlight that aspect for us?
Yeah. So first of all, it's important for people to understand, especially if you yourself, being a viewer of the show, are a member of a company or employed for a company which is transiting cargo, and it could be the trains or a shipping company or an air freight company. These companies, they don't give you legal protection if you end up committing a crime. So you have a responsibility to obey the law and refuse to transit weapons through, and you also have the protection, because if you say I'm obeying the law and so I cannot transit this weapon, you cannot be then punished for not doing your job, because in fact you are doing your job. You are acting in a legal way with your responsibility. So I think in Germany this is not understood enough. It needs to be understood, and the unions need to make a clear statement. In other countries, the unions have already made that statement. We've heard it from unions in Belgium, in Portugal, in Spain, in Italy, in Cyprus, in Greece. In Greece, there was even a group of union workers, of dock workers and sailors. They received information that a ship that docked in Greece is carrying containers of ammunition to Israel. They managed to take one of those containers and bring it to the fish market in Piraeus. Piraeus is a city not far from Athens. And they guarded this container of ammunition to prevent it from being taken back into the ship. So they effectively stopped this container from being sent to Israel. This container contained ammunition, light ammunition, like for pistols, rifles, machine guns. In one container, you can have hundreds of thousands of these bullets. Just try to imagine how many lives they have saved. And of course, they were not arrested because what they did was completely legal. So this shows how the grassroots movement is very, very effective. And I also want to highlight Spain, because in Spain, you had, there is currently a socialist government which is considered to be leftist, but it was very clear in its position that it was not interested in implementing any kind of military embargo against Israel. And in fact, the Prime Minister of Spain even gave misleading information back in February, where he said that Spain stopped selling weapons to Israel after October 7 of 23. This was proven wrong. There were hundreds of thousands who protested in the streets. And a Spanish organization called RESCOP, which is Red Solidarity for Palestine, has organized these protests and appealed to the government and went to the media and did very effective work in cooperation with BDS groups from around the world, and RESCOP is also part of the BDS movement, until the government has changed. And you can see the same Prime Minister Sanchez, who previously tried to conceal the weapons that Spain was selling to Israel illegally, is now calling on the EU to implement military embargo on Israel as part of the legal obligations of the European Union. So you see how the grassroots action is where it really makes the difference. Of course, we do need the civil society organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch to give us these reports and to do the research, because a strong campaign is always based on research. It's based on networking with the other groups. It's based on building momentum. And in the end, a military embargo can only be implemented, of course, by governments, by decision makers. But the decision makers cannot choose to defy the public opinion. And if I may say something about Germany again, because in Germany you have more than 60% of the public who is actively opposed to sending weapons to Israel. They understand, the majority of the German public, they understand that the law is very clear on this issue, and also the moral requirement not to give weapons to an army that is committing genocide, which stands even regardless of the international law. But the international law here is clear as well. And the reason that the government is defying the public opinion is also one of the reasons that the government has fallen.
Very interesting report. We will keep a touch on it. But for now, let us switch to Syria and examine the role of Israel in all that is taking place there. On December 8th, Hayat Tahrir al-Shalom, also known as HTS, alongside other forces, successfully overthrew the government of Bashar al-Assad. The various groups that overthrew Assad have now agreed to form a unity government that will consist of the Islamist HTS group and the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. The Israeli Defense Force is conducting what it calls one of the largest military offensives in history and has carried out nearly 500 airstrikes in Syria since the fall of Assad, destroying around 80% of Syria's military capacity. They have also invaded the Golan Heights, which is considered part of the UN buffer zone, destroyed a number of villages and forced the local population to flee. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently announced that his government plans to invest around $11 million in the Golan Heights, as well as visions to double the population there. In a video broadcast from Mount Hermon, the highest peak in the Golan Heights, Netanyahu said that the Israeli Defense Forces would remain here temporarily to ensure Israel's security and, quote, until another solution is found, unquote. It seems that Israel has emerged as the clear geopolitical winner following the fall of Assad. Iran's proxy Hezbollah was already weakened following the Israel's assassination of its leadership, and now Hezbollah has lost effectively its supply line from Iran. As well as the fall of Assad has now a hostile neighbor right in front of its borders. I'm talking in terms of Iran. Can you talk about the role, if any, that Israel might have played in the overthrow of Assad? And then provide your geopolitical assessment in terms of Israel following Assad's fall.
Okay, Zain, I must apologize, but I have to take apart a lot of what you said right now. Starting with HTS's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, not Shalom. But more importantly, let's talk about what's really happening. What you have been describing is a lot of Israeli propaganda. The so-called Israeli military operation in Syria, the big military operation. I think we can agree that the Assad regime in Syria, I'm speaking about the regime of the son and the father, Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. Both of them were not pacifists. They were very aggressive and were heavily armed. Nevertheless, when the Israeli military has conducted this so-called operation of destroying what you said, 80% of the Syrian military, they took Israeli journalists with them. And the journalists who were embedded with the Israeli units were reporting on this amazing operation, as they call it, where they find warehouses allegedly for the weapons of the Syrian army and finding nothing, or almost nothing. And the soldiers said, oh, this is very easy. We just found a few pistols, a few bullets, and we succeeded to destroy the Syrian army. So either we were wrong all along, and in fact, Bashar al-Assad was a pacifist and didn't have any weapons, or what is a little bit more likely, I'm afraid, is that they didn't find the weapons. I tried to find images, because the Israeli military is very arrogant and loves to show videos and pictures of how they destroy the Syrian or any target that they're attacking, how they are blowing it up. But check online. You will find very few pictures. There are just a couple of very short videos and pictures which are shown on a loop, because I haven't seen any evidence of where are all the thousands of tanks that Syria used to have, where all the artillery and air force. This is not something that maybe most importantly the missiles. So what we see is in fact a big propaganda statement by the Israeli government, trying to say that even though the Israeli economy is collapsing, even though hundreds of thousands of Israelis are leaving the country, the Israeli high-tech sector has already pretty much collapsed. There is no economic plan for the future, and also no strategic plan for the future. The army is running out of soldiers. People are furious, despaired. I'm talking about the Jewish Israelis. Yeah, they are themselves afraid, despairing. They were told that Israel has an impenetrable dome of interception ability against enemy missiles, and yet missiles and drones fall on Tel Aviv every day. So there is no a real protection from these things. And Netanyahu just wants to say, oh, but everything is wonderful. We are winning on the geopolitical level. In Israel, I can find some propaganda newspapers that are very close to Netanyahu and are promoting this narrative. But even within Israel, most of the newspapers are not saying what you are saying. They're saying, no, this is a lot of big statements. Netanyahu, by the way, didn't say temporarily staying in Syria. He said as long as necessary, which means forever. And Israel is already completely occupied and annexed the Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan Heights, but now they're going further into the demilitarized zone. And there is a mountain called the Hermon Mountain, which has two parts of this mountain. One part was already occupied and illegally annexed by Israel. Now they've also occupied the second part of that mountain. So this is what's actually happening, where the Israeli forces are moving, but they don't have soldiers to hold that ground. And you have those messianic, extremist religious fanatics, some of them are in the government, very senior people, who are now saying, oh, well, we're going to ethnically cleanse Gaza and populate it with Jews, settle it with illegal colonies. We'll do the same in Lebanon, we'll do the same in Syria. And they imagine that there's going to be, well, who knows what's next, if it's going to be Jordan and Egypt that Israel will destroy, invade, and colonize next. But these are their fantasies, and they're based on their assumption that the Messiah will come. So if you believe that kind of theology, maybe you think this is sustainable. I don't. I see what's happening with soldiers reporting that when they're called for duty, a platoon which is supposed to have about 100 soldiers, 6 show up. 6 show up out of 100. So platoons are being dismantled because they don't have enough person power. So right now we see a very a moment of waiting. Everyone is waiting to see what Trump is going to do. Right now is not a good time, of course, for anyone to make big one-sided moves, because Biden, which has nothing to lose, has already shown that he's willing to give Israel very deadly, very dangerous weapons without any repercussions and any considerations to what it means also financially for the United States to give all those very like state-of-the-art weapons. After Israel uses them and the world sees what these weapons do, then the weapons are no longer state-of-the-art. So so why would then Iran or any forces in Syria or in Lebanon make a big move right now? It just doesn't make strategic sense for them. But regarding the geopolitical strength or so-called strength of Israel, when Israel is losing its connection to the West, and only has the United States and Germany as the final countries that refuse to condemn Israeli atrocities, and losing its trade and losing its economy, is Israel really stronger in the region? Let's just remember one thing, that the Assad regime, both father and son, for the last 50 years, since the war of 1973, have had an unspoken agreement with Israel. Or maybe it was spoken, but I don't know. I mean, it wasn't published. But there was an agreement that they will not attack Israel for 50 years. Israel has attacked Iran, and Syria did not respond. Israel bombed and killed people in Iran, and Syria did not respond for 50 years. So if somebody thinks that HDS is going to be more friendly to Israel than the Assad regime, then I have to ask, in what way can they be more friendly? How can this be a gain for Israel? Without understanding the internal political situation in Israel, the fact that Netanyahu is standing trial, the fact that Netanyahu is supposed to give a testimony under oath regarding his corruption cases, he's not tried for his war crimes and crimes against humanity. He's only tried for corruption cases within Israel. But this is still a threat to his ability to remain prime minister. And he said that he has to leave the testimony in the middle because of something very urgent. And rumors started spreading that the urgent thing that is calling Netanyahu away is the fact that he's going to sign a ceasefire agreement with Hamas and bring back the hostages. And so hopes were skyrocketing in Israel. The Israeli prime minister plane like the Air Force One of Israel, which is called Knaf Tzion, has flown in the general direction of Egypt. So people said, oh, this Netanyahu is going to Egypt to sign an agreement. Amazing. Instead, Netanyahu said later the reason that he had to leave the testimony in the middle is that he had to stand on the Syrian part of the Hermon mountain in Syria and announce that Israel will stay there forever. So this forever thing couldn't have waited another day, because in that day he had to give a testimony. And the plane just flew empty back and forth. So you see what a simple trick it was in order to fool the Israeli public. Let's not get fooled along with the Israeli public with these very cheap tricks.
It is quite noteworthy that the leadership in Damascus, the new leadership in Damascus, has not strongly condemned any of Israel's actions, whether it be the destruction of its military, which you in some ways debunked through Israeli airstrike, or the invasion of the Golan Heights. At the very least, one would expect these groups to call on the United Nations to condemn these actions. Benjamin Netanyahu has a long history of portraying himself as a fighter against Islamic terrorism, and he even wrote a book titled, quote, Fighting Terrorism, How Democracies Can Defeat Domestic and International Terrorism, unquote. He also stated last year that Hamas was worse than ISIS in terms of ideology and practice, and therefore must be destroyed. Yet, despite HTS clearly having a history with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and even having a large force on the ground that adheres to these ideologies, he has not been quite vocal in criticizing them. HTS and the Islamic forces are all witnesses to the destruction of civilians in Gaza, most of whom are Muslims. We all know that the majority population in Arab countries support the Palestinian cause, especially in Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Do you think HTS will be able to keep the Palestinian issue under wraps and maintain this silent relationship with Israel, given this context?
I really cannot answer you about HTS, because I'm not an expert on this, and I cannot tell you what's happening in the corridors of power in Syria or in Lebanon or in Iran. I can tell you what's happening in Israel. And I want to remind you that what you said about Netanyahu presenting himself as an expert on terrorism, there's no shortage of such experts, so-called experts in Israel. In fact, the biggest opposition to Netanyahu, the leaders of the military and the secret police and the Mossad, who oppose Netanyahu and demonstrate against him, they often claim to be bigger experts than him. But Netanyahu does have one thing that distinguishes him from the others, which is his obsession about Iran. This obsession goes very far into the past. It goes into the early 90s, before he was prime minister the first time, where he started by building his career by saying the real threat to Israel is not the Palestinians but Iran. But this argument is, of course, intended to obfuscate the fact that Israel is a colonial state, a colonial society. There will never be security in a situation of apartheid. Palestinians are the indigenous population of Palestine. And Netanyahu wants to erase them and say that Iran is the real enemy of Israel. But this argument is, of course, strategically speaking, worthless, right? Because if he closes his eyes and he asks the Israeli public to close their eyes to the real reality of where they live, then they will not be able to achieve any kind of strategic advantages. And in that context, it does make sense for Netanyahu's own narrative to say Iran is behind everything, Iran is the mastermind of everything bad that ever happened to Israel, to say that Israel's operations, the invasion of Lebanon, the killing of people, the pager attack, which was a severe violation of international law, then the invasion of Syria, these are all acts, and now also let's not forget the bombing in Yemen. These are all acts which are actually aimed at weakening Iran. So if you accept this idea as if Iran is some kind of evil mastermind intended to destroy Israel, and not that Israel as a colonial society is built on the exploitation of the Palestinian people, and they are fighting to survive and to exist in their own country as free people, then it may look like Israel is winning. So let's not follow this logic, but see what's really happening. And what is really happening is that every time Netanyahu is changing the conversation and say, let's talk about Iran, look at Iran, it distracts from the reality in Palestine. And if we want to know where this is going, we have to look at Palestine, not at Iran.
Dr. Shir Hever, independent journalist, author, and economic researcher, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you, Zain.
And thank you for tuning in today. If you watched the video until the very end, please just take a few moments and visit the description of this video and find out how you can support our crowdfunding so that we can continue with our journalism in 2025. We are an independent and non-profit media organization that does not take any money from corporations or governments. We don't even allow advertisement, all with the goal of providing you with information that is free from any external influence. We thank you for tuning in and your support and generosity. I'm your host, Zain Raza. See you next time.